So you think you can just waltz in, ignore decades of established rights, and build a monstrosity on the edge of my lake? The HOA, in their infinite wisdom and boundless arrogance, certainly thought so when they started erecting their ridiculous Lakeside Vista Resort spa without so much as a by your leave to the person who literally controlled the water feeding their precious view. They were about to learn a very, very wet lesson about due diligence, property rights, and the simple mechanics of an old, forgotten sluice gate that my grandfather, bless his prescient soul, had insisted on maintaining. Their grand opening was going to be a washout, in the most literal sense of the word. My family has owned the land surrounding Blackwood Lake, and the lake itself, for over a century. It wasn't a massive estate by any means, but it was ours, a legacy passed down through generations who cherished its quiet beauty and the peculiar ecosystem it supported. The lake was spring-fed, but its primary water source and, crucially, its outflow were governed by an ingenious system of weirs and a main sluice gate at the northern outflow creek, all situated squarely on my property, a detail clearly marked on every historical survey map and land deed since the early 1900s. My grandfather, a man who believed in self-sufficiency and the sanctity of one's own domain, had taught me the workings of that sluice gate when I was just a kid. "This, my dear," he'd said, his hand resting on the large, rust-covered iron wheel, "is the heart of Blackwood. You treat her right, she'll treat you right. But you always remember, you're the steward here. You control the flow." I never forgot those words, or the quiet responsibility that came with them. For years, I'd maintained the mechanism, cleared debris, greased the gears, ensuring it remained operational, more out of respect for his memory and a vague sense of preparedness than any actual need. The lake level had a natural rhythm, high in the spring, lower in late summer, and the sluice was mostly for flood prevention during extreme rain or snowmelt, allowing controlled release. The surrounding area was mostly undeveloped woodland, part of our land, and a few distant farms. Then, about 10 years ago, the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association began to develop a parcel of land to the east of the lake, previously old logging territory they'd bought up cheap. Initially, they were just a cluster of houses, far enough away not to be a nuisance. Their presence was minimal, a few more cars on the county road, the distant sound of lawnmowers on a Saturday. I minded my business. They, mostly, minded theirs. But HOAs, I've learned, are like invasive species. They start small, then they spread, and then they start trying to change the entire ecosystem to suit their artificial preferences. Their bylaws, which I later had the misfortune of glancing at when a misdelivered newsletter landed in my mailbox, were a tome of petty restrictions and self-important regulations that seemed designed to suck the joy out of homeownership. I remember thinking, thank God my property isn't part of that circus. The initial signs of trouble were subtle. A few casually dropped remarks from an HOA board member I encountered at the local hardware store. A woman named Brenda Mulroney, who had the tight-lipped, perpetually offended look of someone who'd found a calling in telling others what to do. She'd made some comment about the untamed nature of my shoreline, implying it was an eyesore compared to their meticulously manicured common areas. I'd politely informed her that nature had its own aesthetic, one that didn't require a weekly trim and chemical intervention. She'd sniffed, her eyes cataloging every perceived flaw in my property line, and trotted off. That was the first inkling I had that their definition of community might eventually try to extend its tendrils onto my land, or at least influence how I used it. The lake, my beautiful, serene Blackwood Lake, was becoming a feature in their sales brochures, I later discovered. Lakeside, living at Whispering Pines, they advertised, conveniently omitting the fact that the lake wasn't theirs to offer. The problem was, Their development slowly crept closer, buying up adjacent plots until their newest phase was practically bordering the easternmost edge of my property line, the one that ran along a significant portion of the lake's shore. They were still separated by a 20-foot band of woodland that was mine, but the proximity was becoming uncomfortable. They couldn't directly access the lake from their new plots without trespassing, but they certainly had a view, and that view, apparently, was about to get a whole lot more developed. The first official salvo came in the form of a glossy, professionally printed proposal left leaning against my mailbox, because apparently, walking up my driveway to use the actual mailbox slot was too much effort for the HOA envoy. It was titled, "The Whispering Pines, Lakeside Vista Resort, Spa, a Community Enhancement Project." My blood pressure spiked before I even opened it. Inside, architectural renderings depicted a sprawling, 3-story building with balconies, a restaurant, a pool deck, and a series of docks jutting out into my lake. It was positioned, according to their ludicrous site plan, on a parcel of land they'd recently acquired immediately adjacent to my eastern boundary, so close that their proposed infinity pool would practically overhang my property line. The docks, of course, were a complete non-starter, as they would be anchored in the lake bed that belonged to me. I sat on my porch, the proposal trembling in my hand, a mixture of disbelief and cold anger rising within me. A community enhancement? It was an invasion. I immediately called the number listed for the HOA president, the aforementioned Brenda Mulroney. She answered with an infuriatingly chipper, "Whispering Pines, HOA, Brenda speaking. How may I enhance your day?" I skipped the pleasantries. "This is narrator's name from the Blackwood Lake property. I've just received your ambitious proposal for a hotel. You do realize that the lake itself, the water, the shoreline you intend to build on, and the land under your proposed docks are all part of my private property, don't you?" There was a pause, then a patronizing chuckle. "Oh, Mr. Ms. Narrator's name, so nice to finally hear from you. We were hoping you'd be excited about the progress. As for the lake, well, it's a natural feature, isn't it? We all benefit from its beauty. Our lawyers have assured us that as long as our structure is on our land and any access points are for community enjoyment, it's all perfectly above board. Progress can't be stopped, you know." Her tone was dismissive, as if I were a quaint relic, an amusing obstacle that would soon be brushed aside by the march of progress. "Brenda," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could, "I don't think you understand. I own the lake. The actual H2O, the lake bed, the fishing rights, the boating rights, and, most importantly, the water rights, including the control of the outflow. Your lawyers might want to take a closer look at the original land patents and deeds for this entire area, specifically Folio 7B, Section 12, dating back to 1903. My family has controlled the water levels of this lake for over 100 years. Your proposed hotel, from what I can see, is situated perilously close to the historical high water mark, a mark that, I assure you, is quite achievable." Another light laugh. "Oh, high water marks, such old-fashioned concerns. We have top engineers. They've done all the surveys. Besides, it's for the betterment of the whole community, bringing in tourism, raising property values. You wouldn't want to stand in the way of that, would you? Perhaps we could offer you a complimentary spa membership once it's built." The sheer audacity was breathtaking. I explained, slowly and clearly, that this wasn't a negotiation, that their project as designed was a non-starter because it encroached on my property and water rights. I warned her, explicitly, that building so close to the lake, without consulting me on water levels and historical floodlines, was an act of profound foolishness. Her response was a breezy, "Well, we'll certainly take your comments under advisement. Our board meeting is next Tuesday, and we'll be voting to move forward. Progress, as I said." And she hung up. I immediately contacted my lawyer, a sharp woman named Carol, who specialized in property disputes. I forwarded her the HOA's proposal and copies of all my deeds and the historical documents relating to the sluice gate and water rights. Carol was initially aghast at the HOA's plans. Then, after reviewing my documents, a grim smile spread across her face. "They really haven't done their homework, have they?" she mused. "This is airtight. You not only own the lake, but the control mechanism is entirely on your land, and your right to operate it is clearly stipulated." She advised sending a formal cease and desist letter, outlining my undisputed rights and warning them of legal action if they proceeded with any construction that infringed on my property, including the lake itself, or that was sited within a zone vulnerable to water level changes I was entitled to make. The letter was sent via registered mail, return receipt requested. A week later, the signed receipt came back, indicating Brenda Mulroney herself had received it. Her response? Utter silence, followed by the distant but unmistakable sound of survey crews, and then, a few weeks later, bulldozers on the land adjacent to mine. The HOA was actually going through with it. The cease and desist letter, so carefully drafted by Carol, had about as much impact on Brenda Mulroney and her HOA cronies as a feather landing on a charging rhinoceros. The surveyors arrived first, tramping along the edge of my property line, planting little orange flags with an air of officious self-importance. I watched them from my porch, coffee cup in hand, a cold knot forming in my stomach. One of them, a younger man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, made eye contact. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. He quickly looked away. Brenda, it seemed, had painted me as the local eccentric, the unreasonable hermit standing in the way of glorious community development. I could almost hear her telling the board, "Oh, don't mind him, her, just a bit possessive of that old pond. Our plans are sound." The bulldozers were next. The deep rumble started early one Monday morning, a guttural violation of the usual lakeside peace. Trees that had stood for decades on their property, but which formed part of the natural buffer and beauty of the lake's edge, were felled with brutal efficiency. I documented everything. Every truck, every piece of equipment, every surveyed stake that seemed to lean just a little too far towards my land. I took photos, dated and time-stamped. I made notes in a detailed logbook. Carol had advised me to create an unimpeachable record of their recklessness. I even invested in a couple of discreet, motion-activated wildlife cameras and positioned them with views overlooking the construction site and the relevant portions of my property line. It felt like overkill, but something about Brenda's dismissive attitude told me this was going to get ugly. I tried reasoning with the construction foreman once, a burly man named Gus, with a sun-weathered face and calloused hands. I walked over to my property line one afternoon, holding a copy of my survey map. "Gus," I called out, not stepping onto their site. He sauntered over, wiping grease from his hands. "Yeah? I just want to make sure your crews are aware of the precise property boundaries. And also of the fact that this entire lake, including the water you're building next to, is private property." I pointed to my map. The historical high water line for this lake is significantly further inland than your current foundation work, and I control the sluice gate that manages that water level. Gus squinted at my map, then at the stakes for the foundation they were pouring. He grunted, "Lady, mister, I just build what they tell me to build. The plans are signed off by the HOA, engineers, county probably. Above my pay grade, But if those plans are based on faulty information, if they're building on a floodplain that I control, Gus just shrugged. Look, I got a job to do. If you got a problem with the plans, you gotta take it up with the HOA. They're the ones paying the bills. He turned and walked back to his machinery, clearly uninterested in potential future aquatic disasters. I saw Brenda Mulroney on site a few times, striding around in a hard hat that looked comically oversized on her, pointing imperiously and talking animatedly into her phone. She never once acknowledged my presence, though I knew she saw me. It was a deliberate snub, a power play. Her message was clear. We are doing this, and you are irrelevant. The local newspaper even ran a small fluff piece about the exciting new Whispering Pines resort, complete with a picture of Brenda beaming, shovel in hand, at a groundbreaking ceremony I hadn't been invited to. The article mentioned enhancing local tourism and state-of-the-art design. Not a word about the adjacent property owner or any potential concerns. I sent a letter to the editor, calmly stating my ownership of the lake and my documented control of its water levels, and warning of the folly of the HOA's construction. They never published it. Too controversial. The editor had apparently mumbled to a friend of mine who worked there part-time. The HOA, it turned out, was a significant advertiser. My warnings, both legal and informal, were being systematically ignored, buried, and dismissed. It was infuriating, but it also strengthened my resolve. They were, quite literally, building the foundation of their own destruction, and they were doing it with an arrogance that was almost palpable. Carol advised patience. Let them build, she said, a hint of grim satisfaction in her voice. Let them pour the concrete, put up the walls, install the fixtures. Every dollar they spend is a dollar they'll lose. Your case only gets stronger, and their liability more spectacular, the further they proceed in direct opposition to your documented rights and explicit warnings. So, I watched, I documented, and I waited. The hole for the foundation was dug alarmingly close to the water's edge. The concrete was poured. The framing began to rise, a skeletal mockery of the opulent resort Brenda envisioned. And with every nail hammered, with every beam hoisted into place, I thought of my grandfather's words. You control the flow. The construction of the Lakeside Vista Resort Spa proceeded with a speed that was almost impressive if it weren't so monumentally ill-advised. Walls went up, a roof was added, and soon the gaudy facade, a strange mix of faux rustic logs and modern plate glass, began to take shape. Brenda Mulroney was a frequent visitor to the site, often seen conferring with architects and contractors, her gestures becoming grander and more theatrical as her vision materialized. I imagined her preening, already picturing herself as the queen of this lakeside castle. The irony, of course, was that the lake part of her lakeside vista was entirely dependent on my goodwill, or rather, my adherence to maintaining the lake at a level convenient for her folly. I continued my meticulous documentation. The wildlife cameras captured daily progress, the timestamps irrefutable. I took close-up photos of any runoff from their site, seeping onto my land, any debris that crossed the property line. I even started taking regular measurements of the distance from the water's edge to their foundation, noting it in my log. These weren't for any immediate action, but as Carol said, the more evidence of their blatant disregard, the better. Friends, and the few neighbors who weren't part of the HOA cult, would occasionally ask me, with concerned expressions, "Aren't you going to do something? They're really building that thing." I'd offer a calm, enigmatic smile. "I've informed them of the situation. I'd say, they've chosen their course of action. Now, we just have to see how it plays out." Some interpreted this as resignation, and I heard whispers that I'd given up or didn't have the stomach for a fight. "Brenda," I'm sure, interpreted it as a victory for her indomitable will. Little did they know, my strategy was one of strategic inaction, a waiting game where their every move only dug their hole deeper. My weapon, the old sluice gate, sat quietly on my property, a silent, rusty sentinel. I made a few discreet visits to it, ostensibly to clear some fallen branches from the outflow creek. While there, I double-checked the mechanism. The wheel was stiff but turned with a bit of effort. The gear teeth were intact. I had a specialized wrench that fit the main pinion, a tool my grandfather had fashioned himself. I made sure it was still in its place in my workshop, cleaned and oiled. One particularly dry spell in late summer, the lake level naturally receded a bit more than usual. The construction crews, emboldened, actually started landscaping even closer to the water, planting sad-looking ornamental grasses on a strip of land that was, during wetter periods, often submerged. I saw Brenda there, pointing proudly at these new plantings, her voice carrying across the water as she explained to some visiting HOA board members how this would create a seamless transition to the tranquil waters. I almost laughed out loud. Tranquil for now, I decided on a small, almost imperceptible test. One evening, after the construction crews had left for the day, I went to the sluice gate. Using the heavy wrench, I gave the wheel a very slight turn, opening the gate just a fraction more than its usual setting for that time of year. Not enough to cause a dramatic change, but enough to allow a little more water to escape, to subtly lower the lake level by perhaps an inch or two over the next week. My intention was twofold. Firstly, to confirm the responsiveness of the mechanism after years of only minor adjustments, and secondly, to see if anyone at the HOA would even notice such a minor fluctuation. They didn't. Their top engineers and their surveys apparently didn't account for active water management, only passive observation of its current state. After a week, I readjusted the gate to its normal setting, and the lake slowly recovered its fractional loss. The test was successful. The mechanism worked perfectly, and the HOA was blissfully, dangerously ignorant. As autumn approached, the exterior of the hotel was largely complete. Interior work was progressing rapidly. They even installed gleaming brass letters above the grand entrance. Lakeside Vista Resort Spa. I received an ostentatiously printed invitation in the mail, not a personal one, but a generic mailer sent to the wider community. It announced the grand opening gala scheduled for the first weekend in November. An evening of elegance and lakeside splendor, it proclaimed. There would be champagne, a live band, local dignitaries. Brenda Mulroney's name was prominently featured as the visionary behind the project. The invitation went straight into my evidence file alongside a mental note. Target date acquired. Carol called me shortly after the invitations went out. Have you seen this? She asked, a chuckle in her voice. They're really rolling out the red carpet for their own demise. Indeed, I replied. And the timing couldn't be more perfect. November is typically a wetter month. A little help from my end, and the lake should be looking particularly splendid for their gala. Just make sure all your documentation is in order, and that you're prepared for the inevitable fallout, Carol advised. Oh, I am, I assured her. I've been preparing for this for months. They built their castle on sand, or rather, on a floodplain they chose to ignore. I simply intend to remind the lake where it's supposed to be. The trap was set. Their arrogance, their dismissiveness, their deliberate ignorance of my rights and warnings had led them to this point. They were so proud of their creation, so sure of their dominance. They had no idea that the quaint, quiet neighbor they dismissed held the reins to the very element they were trying to exploit. The weeks leading up to the grand opening gala were a flurry of activity at the Lakeside Vista Resort Spa. Trucks delivered expensive-looking furniture. Landscaping crews laid down sod that was already struggling with the autumn chill, and strings of festive lights were hung around the property. Brenda Mulroney was practically living on site, a whirlwind of self-importance, micromanaging every detail. I watched, a silent observer, the anticipation coiling within me, a cold, satisfying knot. I chose my moment carefully, 3 days before the gala. The weather forecast predicted a series of steady, soaking autumn rains starting the next day, which would naturally contribute to raising the water table and the inflow to Blackwood Lake. My actions would simply augment what nature was already beginning to do, making it seem like a particularly unfortunate, but perhaps not entirely unnatural surge. On a gray, overcast afternoon, with the wind whipping leaves from the trees and the construction site deserted as the crews made their final preparations indoors, I walked to the northern outflow creek. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and impending rain. I carried a heavy-duty flashlight, my grandfather's custom wrench, and a pair of thick work gloves. The old sluice gate mechanism looked almost sinister in the dim light, a forgotten piece of industrial history. But to me, it was beautiful, a testament to foresight and a tool of impending justice. The iron wheel was cold and rough beneath my gloved hands. I fitted the wrench onto the pinion nut, took a deep breath, and began to turn. It was stiff, requiring significant effort, a testament to the forces it was designed to hold back. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to close the main outflow gate. Not all at once, not a sudden, dramatic slam that might cause a surge detectable downstream, but gradually, incrementally. Each turn of the wrench was measured, deliberate. I imagined the heavy iron gate inching downwards, restricting the creek's flow, encouraging the lake to swell, to reclaim its historical boundaries. Over the course of an hour, I closed it significantly, not completely. That might be too obvious, and could risk damage to the dam structure itself over a prolonged period, but enough to ensure a substantial rise in the lake level over the next few days, especially with the predicted rainfall. I envisioned the water, denied its usual escape route, beginning to back up, to spread, to seek new confines. Confines that would, I knew with absolute certainty, include the brand new, arrogantly placed foundations and ground floor of the Lakeside Vista Resort Spa. I double-checked my work, then packed my tools and walked back to my house, a sense of calm finality settling over me. The first soft drops of rain began to fall as I reached my porch. Perfect timing. The next morning, the rain was steady, a relentless downpour. I made myself a coffee and sat by my window, looking out at the lake. It was already visibly higher, the water inching up the shoreline, creeping towards the manicured lawns of the HOA's new masterpiece. By midday, small puddles were forming at the lowest points of their landscaping. I could see a few figures, presumably HOA officials or hotel staff, scurrying about in raincoats, looking concerned, pointing towards the rising water. Brenda Mulroney's car, a shiny black SUV, was parked near the entrance. I could only imagine the panicked phone calls being made. The rain continued throughout the day and into the night. The following morning, 2 days before the gala, the transformation was dramatic. Blackwood Lake was no longer lapping at the edges of the resort's property. It was on the property. The newly laid sod was submerged. The ornamental grasses were pathetic, drowned stalks. Water was visibly seeping into the lower levels of the hotel through weep holes and under doorways. I saw men with sandbags, a frantic, futile effort to hold back the inevitable. Their expensive infinity pool now had a much larger, muddier cousin surrounding it. The lake itself had a wild, powerful look to it, churned by the wind and swollen with rain and restricted outflow. It was reclaiming its territory. Later that day, I saw a pump truck arrive. They ran hoses into what I presumed was the basement or ground floor service areas, trying to pump the water out. But it was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. For every gallon they pumped, 2 more seemed to seep in. The lake was asserting its dominance, a slow, inexorable flood of my making, amplified by nature's own downpour. Their lakeside vista was rapidly becoming a lake-submerged vista. The schadenfreude was exquisite, a slow-burn satisfaction that warmed me despite the autumn chill. They had been warned. They had been arrogant, and now they were facing the entirely predictable, entirely preventable consequences. Their grand edifice, a monument to their greed and disregard, was slowly succumbing to the patient, persistent power of water, a power they had forgotten I held. The day of the supposed grand opening gala dawned gray and miserable, the rain having finally tapered off to a drizzle, but the damage was well and truly done. Blackwood Lake had asserted its presence with undeniable force. The lower floor of the Lakeside Vista Resort Spa was visibly inundated. Water lapped against the windows of what I knew were the planned restaurant and luxury suites. The newly paved parking lot was a shallow pond with bewildered-looking ducks already paddling around the submerged valet parking sign. The festive lights they'd strung up drooped sadly, some shorting out with pathetic little fizzles if they touched the water. It was a scene of utter, sodden chaos. My phone started ringing early. It was Carol. "I take it you've seen the news," she asked, unable to keep the amusement from her voice. Or rather, the lack of a gala. "I've been observing the lake's enthusiastic embrace of its new neighbor," I replied dryly. "Apparently, it decided the resort needed a more thorough baptism than planned." "Brenda Mulroney has been on local radio," Carol informed me, blaming unprecedented flash flooding and negligent county drain maintenance. Not a word about ignoring property rights or building on a known flood-prone area next to a privately controlled body of water. "Of course not," I said. "Accountability isn't in her vocabulary, but facts are stubborn things, especially when they're 6 inches deep in your lobby." Around mid-morning, a procession of vehicles began arriving, not the caterers and guests Brenda had anticipated, but insurance adjusters, emergency remediation crews with bigger pumps, and a gaggle of very stressed-looking HOA board members. I saw Brenda herself, her face a mask of fury and disbelief, her usual imperious stride reduced to a careful slosh through her ruined dream. She was gesturing wildly, her voice, even from a distance, sounding shrill and panicked. The grand entrance with its gleaming brass letters now had a watermark about a foot high. The evening of elegance and lakeside splendor was definitively canceled. Later that afternoon, just as I was enjoying a quiet cup of tea and the view of my beautifully swollen lake, I saw a familiar figure trudging up my driveway. It was Brenda Mulroney, sans hard hat, her expensive shoes ruined, her hair plastered to her head by the damp, her usual confidence entirely absent. She looked defeated, drenched, and furious. I met her on the porch, maintaining a polite but firm distance. "Mr. Ms. Narrator's name," she began, her voice tight with barely suppressed rage. This flooding! It's a catastrophe! Our resort, our beautiful resort, it's ruined!" I sipped my tea. Indeed, it appears the lake decided to reclaim some of its old territory. As I recall, I did warn you about the historical high-water marks and my control over the outflow. Her eyes narrowed. "Are you saying you did this? You deliberately flooded us?" "Mrs. Mulroney," I said calmly, "I merely ensured the lake maintained a healthy, natural level, particularly given the recent heavy rains. My family has managed this lake for over a century. The sluice gate at the northern outflow is a crucial part of that management. It's clearly marked on all relevant deeds and surveys. documents I believe your legal team received some months ago via my attorney. If your top engineers failed to account for the lake's documented potential range and the active management of its levels when they sited your building, that's hardly my responsibility. You chose to build in a known vulnerable area, despite explicit warnings. She sputtered, speechless for a moment. But the cost, the investors, the community. This will bankrupt the HOA. Perhaps the HOA should have exercised more due diligence before embarking on such an ambitious project on the edge of a privately owned and controlled body of water, I suggested mildly. I believe the term is caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. Or, in this case, let the builder beware. You can't just do this, she finally choked out. We'll sue you. We'll sue you for everything you have. I smiled faintly. You're welcome to try, Mrs. Mulroney. My lawyer Carol is very familiar with my case and my incontrovertible rights. She's been expecting your call, or rather, your lawyer's call. She has a very comprehensive file detailing every warning you ignored, every encroachment, every instance of your organization's deliberate disregard for my property. She also has excellent hydrologists and surveyors on standby who can attest to the lake's historical behavior and the proper functioning of my control systems. Brenda stared at me, the fight slowly draining out of her. The implications of my words, the cold, hard reality of her predicament, seemed to finally be sinking in. She had been so sure of her power, so dismissive of mine. You planned this, she whispered, her voice hoarse. You let us build it, knowing you'd do this. I gave you every opportunity to reconsider, I corrected her gently. You and your board chose to proceed with extreme prejudice against my rights and common sense. You built your monument to arrogance. I simply allowed the lake to provide the commentary. She turned then, without another word, and squelched her way back down my driveway, a truly pathetic figure. The Lakeside Vista Resort spa never opened. The insurance claims were, I heard, a nightmare for the HOA, especially when my lawyer preemptively provided the insurance companies with copies of our correspondence and warnings to the HOA. The investors pulled out. Recriminations flew. Brenda Mulroney was, predictably, ousted as HOA president in a particularly acrimonious emergency meeting. The lawsuits did come, not just against me, which Carol swatted away with ease, citing my clear rights and their gross negligence, but more devastatingly, from within the HOA, as members sued the board for mismanagement and financial ruin. The half-built, now water-damaged hotel stood as a decaying monument to their folly for nearly a year before the bank foreclosed on the loan the HOA had taken out. It was eventually torn down, the land sold at a loss to a conservation group, who thankfully let it return to its natural state. Blackwood Lake slowly returned to its usual rhythms, the shoreline healing. I still went to the sluice gate, of course, maintaining it, respecting the legacy my grandfather had passed down. Sometimes, I'd look across the water to where the resort had briefly stood, a ghost of an arrogant dream, and I'd smile. They learned the hard way. You don't mess with a person's land, you don't dismiss their rights, and you certainly don't build your grand designs on the edge of their lake, especially when they hold the key to the water. As for the HOA, they're still there, but much diminished, chastened, and with a newfound, if grudging, respect for property lines and old, forgotten sluice gates. And if you're ever dealing with an HOA that thinks it can just roll over you, remember this story. Do your research, know your rights, and sometimes the oldest, quietest powers are the ones that speak the loudest. Drop a comment if you've ever had your own HOA nightmare. I'd love to hear I'm not alone in these battles against the titans of taupe. The aftermath was a slow, gratifying unraveling of the Whispering Pines, HOA's grand ambitions. Their attempt to paint me as the villain quickly fell apart under the weight of evidence Carol systematically presented to anyone who would listen, and many, including disgruntled HOA members and bewildered local officials, were suddenly very willing to listen. The narrative of unprecedented flash flooding was torpedoed by historical rainfall data, meteorological reports that showed the rainfall was significant, but not catastrophic, and expert testimony that highlighted the crucial role of the now infamous sluice gate. My control of that gate, and my right to operate it, was undeniable, etched into deeds that were centuries old. The HOA's own top engineers were forced to admit under questioning during preliminary legal skirmishes that their site surveys had focused primarily on soil stability and boundary lines, making assumptions about lake levels based on recent, relatively dry years, rather than a thorough investigation of historical flood data or the existence and operational status of any outflow controls. It was a catastrophic oversight, born of arrogance and a desire to cut corners to maximize the developable footprint. Brenda Mulroney, stripped of her presidency and facing potential personal liability in some of the lawsuits, became a local pariah. I'd see her occasionally at the grocery store, her former imperious aura completely deflated. She'd avoid eye contact, scuttling down the aisles as if ashamed to be seen. It was a far cry from the sashaying, hard-hatted commander of the construction site. The financial bleeding for the HOA was immense. Not only was their flagship project a waterlogged ruin, but their insurance provider, armed with Carol's documentation of the prior warnings, argued gross negligence and refused to cover the full extent of the damage, citing that the HOA had knowingly built in a high-risk area after being explicitly informed of the variable water levels and my control thereof. The partial payout they eventually received after a protracted battle barely covered the demolition costs of the hotel skeleton, let alone the lost investment and the mounting legal fees from various lawsuits. Whispering Pines' common areas started to look a little less manicured. Their ambitious community enhancement projects were indefinitely shelved, and their newsletters became dominated by pleas for special assessment fees to cover legal debts. It was a quiet, creeping insolvency. Interestingly, a few of the more reasonable HOA members, the ones who had privately expressed doubts about Brenda's hotel scheme from the start, reached out to me. One older gentleman, a retired engineer himself named Arthur, actually came to my door, hat in hand. "Mr. Ms. Narrator's name," he'd said. "I just wanted to say, well, on behalf of some of us, we're sorry this whole mess happened. Brenda got carried away, and the board just followed her like sheep. Many of us never wanted that monstrosity built so close to your beautiful lake anyway. It felt wrong." I appreciated his candor. We ended up having a surprisingly pleasant conversation about the history of the area, and he even expressed admiration for my grandfather's foresight in installing and maintaining the sluice system. It was a small moment of human connection in an otherwise adversarial saga. He even sheepishly admitted he'd looked up the old deeds himself after the flooding, marveling at how clear my rights were. "She was told, wasn't she?" he'd asked. "Repeatedly, and in writing," I confirmed. He just shook his head, a look of rueful understanding on his face. The land where the hotel had briefly stood remained fallow for a long time. The demolition crews had done their job, but the ground was still scarred, a reminder of the folly. Then, as I mentioned, the conservation group stepped in. They had been trying to acquire more land around Blackwood Lake for years to create a larger wildlife corridor, and the HOA's financial desperation provided the perfect opportunity. They bought the parcel for a fraction of what the HOA had paid with the intention of restoring it to a natural wetland buffer, I was, of course, delighted. I even granted them limited access rights across a corner of my property for their restoration work, on the strict condition that it remained low impact and focused on native species. It felt like the lake was finally able to breathe again, its shores no longer threatened by concrete and misplaced ambition. My life returned to its peaceful rhythm. The lake remained the heart of my property, its moods and levels a familiar comfort. The sluice gate still required its periodic maintenance, a task I performed with a renewed sense of stewardship. It wasn't just an old piece of machinery anymore. It was a symbol of vigilance, of the quiet power of knowing your land and defending your rights. Occasionally, new residents in the further reaches of the Whispering Pines development, unaware of the full history, would ask about the old ruined hotel they'd heard stories about. The older residents would just shake their heads and mutter something about Brenda's folly and the lake that fought back. My part in it was often downplayed or turned into local legend. The quiet neighbor who knew secrets of the water, and that was fine by me. I didn't need accolades. The quiet enjoyment of my unspoiled lake was reward enough. The ultimate vindication came not from a court ruling or a public apology, but from the slow, steady return of nature to the blighted patch of land next to mine. The conservationists planted willows and cattails. Herons and kingfishers began to visit the newly restored wetland. The water, my water, once again lapped against a natural shoreline, free of concrete and arrogance. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the best way to fight a Goliath isn't with shouting and fury, but with quiet knowledge, strategic patience, and an unshakable understanding of the levers you control. They had underestimated me, and they had profoundly underestimated the power inherent in the land and its history. They learned, in the most financially and reputationally devastating way, that some boundaries are not meant to be crossed, and some waters run far deeper and more decisively than they could ever have imagined. And for anyone out there facing their own HOA overreach, remember to check those old deeds, understand your property's history, and never underestimate the power of a well-placed, well-understood asset, be it a sluice gate or a forgotten bylaw. The devil, and often the victory, is in the details.